Hello, everybody. We'll start. Welcome to our fanfare, the Fiber Art Now. It's our interactive part of our magazine, and it's an opportunity for Fiber Art Now to bring contemporary and compelling artists and authors live to our creative community. But this is not a smoothly produced TV program with lots of cameras and editors. We're simply live, authentic conversation. The heart of our Fiber Art Now is our quarterly magazine, so we hope you subscribe. Today, I am so excited to introduce the author of Strange Material, Leanne Prain.
Hi.
Actually, Leanne has 3 books, and I'm lucky to have 2. Been given one for Christmas, and the one we're going to mostly focus on today is Strange Material, Storytelling Through Textile. And we're going to be flipping back and forth here a little bit. Let's see, let's get Leanne right here. Hi, Leanne.
Hi.
I'm excited to hear. We've been talking about your amazing tour across the country, but we'll get into that a little bit. I just wanted to start by having you tell us a little bit about Strange Materials. It's an amazing book, and it should be on everybody's bookshelf. And here's my other thing. I think our fiber schools should include it in their curriculum. How's that?
Thank you. I really love that. So Strange Material, it's my 3rd book, and what I really wanted to do was pick up with some things that had sparked with me when I was writing my first 2 books. So I wrote a book called Yarn Bombing, The Art of Crochet, Knit, Graffiti with Mandy Moore. So that was a book I co-authored in 2009. And then I wrote a book profiling embroidery artists who did very unusual things with stitch work. And through the course of that, talking to different artists, I started to come back to the idea of storytelling, and that everybody was really telling me stories through their work. And so Strange Material is looking at all sorts of forms of narrative, whether it's memoir, nonfiction, stories told through new technologies like Twitter. There's fictions, fables, memoirs, and each chapter focuses on a different sort of narrative. And I've sort of been a little bit free. I've done one narrative that's simply one chapter that's just about humor, because I think humor and comedy is a form of narrative, a very particular one when it's done visually with textiles. So I've profiled 32 people, and there's 8 projects in the book. One is my own, where I collaborated with a poet, Laura Farina, on a poetry scarf. And then there's a bunch of prompts for people. And the idea with that was I really like to write books that I think empower people to try things. So the idea with the prompt is you could, if you're a textile artist and you're looking to sort of bring more meaning or personal meaning into your work, there's some things for you to try in writing that might translate to your visual work. And if you're a writer and you've never tried textiles, my hope is that you'll venture down that road a bit.
Right. I think your prompts were inspiring, and as I went through, I thought, wow, I'd never really had thought of trying it that way, and I've been a textile artist for, I don't know, decades now. What was the process of identifying that group of artists?
Truthfully, it was a little bit of just thematic things that hit me. So I'm sort of a keeper of lists and notebooks, and for this book, it was structured in a way that my other books weren't, where I really did try and find artists to fit forms of narrative. So I was looking for people working through poetry and textiles. I was looking for people who were working with comedic stories through textiles. Mm-hmm. So sometimes it was searching for artists that fit within the structure of the book, which was a little bit different than my research process in the past. But I also just tend to collect a lot of things, and then I look for themes. So I'd be like, well, I found these 5 people, and they're all telling stories that are stories of activism or trying to make personal change. So that will go in the activism chapter. And then I couldn't ignore the amount of artists working with technology, and how some of them were working to tell stories through technology, whether it was talking about there's an artist, Phillips, who works with weavings, and basically his weavings replicate technology gone wrong. So when a file looks a little bit blurry or we get a glitch, and he makes these weavings called glitch textiles. So I thought that, well, that's sort of a commentary on sort of how we're all using and exchanging images right now. And he's putting sort of those disruptions into visual form. And then we have someone like Aviva Olenick, who is an embroidery artist who chronicles a lot of her work in stitched handwriting, but then she was collecting people's poetry that she found through Twitter. She thought tweets weren't just informational things through Twitter, but they could be poetry. So then she's been embroidering tweets. So I couldn't ignore that, so I wanted to bring that into the book as well.
That's really so relevant, boy. But let's, the cover image, I don't know if we can get that up, Victoria. Are you on board with that? You were speaking of, let's see if we can get that. Speaking of, you know, text, I know the cover of the book, the artist on that was really powerful. It was just like, you know, it was a great cover for this book.
Thank you. So the artist on the cover, that's Rosalind Wyatt, and she's in the UK. And this particular piece, what she does is she really likes to delve into historical record. So she went and found a bunch of images from Winston Churchill's, letters from Winston Churchill's childhood. And what she's done is replicate the letters that he wrote to his mother about things that were going on in his life. And then she's perfectly taken his handwriting and recreated it from the letters on this bodice. Is from the period. So it didn't belong to Winston Churchill's mother, but she found something that was historically appropriate. And she's actually a calligrapher by trade. So she actually does all sorts of stitch work on many different projects where she's recreating the handwriting of other people using embroidery. So it looks like it's handwriting, but it's actually all stitch work.
Wow, that's and I'm sorry, I didn't hear the artist's name.
Rosalind Wyatt.
Rosalind Wyatt. Okay,
yeah,
I just want to make sure we acknowledge that.
Yeah, and she actually has another wonderful project called The Stitched Lives of London, where she's now creating different pieces of clothing are now being stitched to replicate different Londoners who've existed throughout history. So she's collecting those stories and putting them on all sorts of garments.
Wow, that's going to be somebody to follow, huh?
Mm-hmm.
That's exciting. Okay, well, you know, we didn't intentionally schedule this interview with you before Halloween. Pretty relevant because the connection with cloth and storytelling is a part of, well, at least in America, the children's world with their costumes. So your chapter on the stories that we wear kind of flows into this.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about like artist Teresa Burrows and well, I know you have we'll talk about the memory sweater, but any of the artists that are focused on stories that we wear.
Yeah, so there was a chapter where I just wanted to talk about wearable stories, and part of how I started that chapter is that I collected clothing stories from people I knew. So whether it was a friend of mine he'd purchasing sneakers when he was a kid and what that meant to him, that he could actively run and suddenly be tough because he had these shoes that made him feel like a different person. There was another woman who had a sweater that was her grandfather's, and after he passed away, she's always kept it in her closet, Leanne Lloyd. So it's that remembrance of keeping that clothing close. And then I started to sort of delve into the fact that we all have personal associations with different sorts of clothing, whether it be, this is Teresa Burrows' work that we're looking at now, I see, whether it's like a high school letter jacket or a wedding dress or a funeral shroud, like a christening gown, all these pieces of clothing mark important pieces in our lives. So there's a few artists that I've included that are doing very expressive things with clothing. Teresa Burrows lives in northern Canada, and she's a beading artist. So all of this that you see that's colored pieces, this is all hand done. And they're all seed beads, and it's meticulous. And she's commenting on the different experiences of women in northern Canada. Some of her work has to deal with people who've been disappeared or who've been overlooked by society. She's been focusing on what she calls the Caribou Women, so women of that region who are sort of a source of Aboriginal leaders, people who have strength and power, but maybe we don't always pay attention to them. And it's also just really visually stunning.
Yeah, no, all those the antlers that she's incorporated. I'd love to see that piece up close. Where is that piece right now?
I believe she's in Manitoba, and I'm sorry, right now the name of the town that she lives in has gone off my radar, but I believe that they're all in her personal collection still. I have seen a few of her pieces at the Winnipeg Art Gallery, so she does tour, but I'm not quite sure if it has an owner right now, that piece.
Right. I know she posted some, oh, there we go.
Posted,
yeah.
This is a piece, of course, the iconic colors on it are a Hudson's Bay blanket, which was sort of the iconic blanket of the fur trade here in Canada. And there is a lot of controversy, and some people say it's myth, some people say it's fact, that this is how smallpox was given to the First Nations people in the fur trade when they weren't fairly treated, yet it's also become an iconic symbol of Canada. So there's a lot of things at play in this piece.
Well, tell me about the memory sweater.
So, yeah. So
I don't think we have a picture of it, but
sure.
Yeah.
So each of the projects in the book are a play off each chapter. So we have there's a chapter on I'm trying to remember. It's in the Remembrance chapter, I believe. Britta Shoe's an artist who is a textile artist, but also has worked with people with dementia. And she wanted to design a sweater that was in memory of her grandmother. So it's a light blue knit sweater with a crocheted trim. And there's a little pocket that's been done out of gauzy fabric over the breast, the heart. And the idea is that you can carry things that are close to you in the project when you wear the sweater. So there's a replica of a letter that was passed between her grandparents. There's a photograph of them on I believe on their wedding day. And then there's her grandmother's wedding ring that's gone in the pocket. So the idea is not only do you have a piece of functional clothing, but you can actually physically carry your memories with you. And it's also designed for people who might not be able to carry memories of important things in their past life with them, but they can carry those objects on them and remember them, whether it's by touch or holding them close.
Wow, that's so, I don't know, always gives me goosebumps, those kinds of stories, but there's probably a lot of stories like that.
Yeah, and I also think it's interesting to think of clothing as not just something that's expressive by the fact that other people notice you when you wear it, but it can have some emotional resonance for you, and I think there's a lot of room to be done in creating garments like that. There's a woman in the poetry chapter, Augustina Woodgate, who did this project called the Poetry Bomber, and she was taking snippets of poetry from famous poets and then going to thrift stores and sewing them into the lapels of jackets and into pants. And that's an interesting project in terms of making poetry public, but also changing a garment that might be, off-cast and overlooked, and suddenly it becomes more valuable or exciting because it has poetry in it.
Oh, look, we got the picture up there. Thank you, Victoria.
Oh,
perfect. Wow. Yeah, so sewing that in there, that's poetry bombing. That's
poetry bombing.
That's really, you've really included so many things that we don't even think are happening. But well, what about your poetry scarf?
Oh, so the poetry scarf was it was a fun project for me. That's actually it looks like relief dye, but it's just a very simple project that's done on a black piece of t-shirt fabric. And I collaborated with my good friend Laura Farina, who's a poet. And so Laura writes very accessible poetry, but I think a lot of people are still very scared of poetry. So we took her poem and we took a bleach pen and we wrote her poem in bleach on the fabric and bleached this poem onto the fabric. And I don't have it here with me because Laura actually took the poem scarf away from me to wear out in public. But the idea is that you can take poetry with you wherever you go. It's an accessible, touchable thing. You can wrap it around your neck. And I love the idea of people having ready access to Laura's poems because they're out there. So
yeah. Oh, wow. I mean, it gives us ideas. It gives me ideas. My head's spinning with that.
I think one of the things, too, with that project, I wrote, it doesn't have to be a poem. It could be a story. It could be a phrase that's resonating with you. And my books are fairly unusual in the fact that most people buy a DIY book and they expect to do, you know, steps 1 through 10. And in the conventions of publishing a book, we have to write steps 1 through 10, but all of the projects are really just a jumping off point. So if you can knit or crochet a sweater, we assume that you'll take close to your heart, and maybe you'll make it exactly as we published it, but maybe you'll come up with something completely new, close to your heart, hat or scarf or mittens or something like that too.
Yeah, I love the mittens, the images of mittens in the book as well. But everybody, there seems to be a lot of people, you know, using their personal storytelling on using maps or stitched diaries. I think, was it Eleanor Hannon that you had in your book with her stitched transcription on cloth?
Yeah, Eleanor Hannon worked on some book projects, so she collaborated with a writer. So they've made a bunch of books that are based on sort of women and fables and skirts. I was trying to think, there was someone else that was coming to mind as you were speaking about that. Sorry, brain blank.
There's Tamara Stone.
Tamara Stone. So Tamara Stone's actually somebody else who's doing historical research. So she's actually taking, one of the images we have in the book is the lives of frontier women, which is a child's doll bed. And she's been stitching stories that have come out of research from diaries and journals. And she stitches stories on the sheets and on the mattress and on the covers. And the idea is you have to do housework actually to read the story. So you're not just reading the story on pages of a book, but you're turning covers and sheets in order to get the whole picture of all these words that are coming out. She's done some life-size beds as well. Unfortunately, she lives in New York, I think, in a small apartment, so there's limitations on the size of her work. So she's primarily been doing doll beds, but I recently met her in New York, and she said in her perfect world she would have a warehouse full of these beds, full size, and everybody, in order to engage with the story, would be coming and doing women's work, which is making the beds in order to get the full story of these women.
And that would be a fantastic exhibit somewhere, wouldn't it? Interactive exhibit. And so it sounds like you're hearing of, have you been hearing readers following us based on what your prompts in the book?
A little bit. I mean, the book just came out on October 1st, so it's only been out live in the world for about 3 weeks. But I was fortunate enough actually to teach a couple workshops on my recent book tour. I was touring with 2 other authors, so we sort of did what we called a creative round robin, where Kim Worker, who I was with, started off participants making ugly dolls, and then we took the ugly dolls and I used some of the writing prompts in the book to help conjure stories about dolls and creative demons, and stories that get conjured up by touching fabric or buttons, and you know how we have associations with remnants of textiles. And then we passed things over to Betsy Greer, who did some stitching and meditation. So we kind of called them craft therapy workshops time we were done. So
I always wonder how much the creative process is done through the subconscious mind versus the conscious mind. You know, touching the fabrics or all those buttons. I don't know if you've seen anything, any of your research based on more of the subconscious works of art?
You know, I haven't gone too much into that. I mean, one of the things that I thought was interesting was I have Agnes Richards' jacket in the book. So Agnes was a woman who was in an Austrian asylum in the late 1800s. And she had this amazing straitjacket that's become part of a museum collection on people who were in a psychiatric hospital, on all the artwork that they created. And the jacket, she was a seamstress by trade, so it's a straitjacket, but it looks like a very stylish woman's jacket. And it's very shaped, and with her stitching, she's pretty much done words on top of words. A lot of them are erratic and unreadable, but then you'll get phrases of her life that'll pop out. And there's been books written just about this jacket, people trying to figure out, you know, what the meaning is, if it's all madness, you know. But I love the fact that there was somebody who comforted themselves by textiles and journaling, and there's phrases from her life in there, and there's a phrase where she's talking about her white silk stockings. So I think it's something that people have always done, I find in the writing process, and part of the reason I love prompts is you'll think you're headed down one road, one creative direction, and then something will come along that completely surprises you, and you'll be like, where did this come from? And
subconscious happening right there.
Yeah, and that's how this book came about for me too. I kept being like, oh, this is a story this person is telling me, or oh, is this some poetry that's happening with this? And then, you know, you start to notice those happen again and again, and there's some synergies there. And I think that happens with anything we make, whether it's writing or something visual. You kind of have to listen to yourself, because you'll get one idea of something should go in one direction, and suddenly things will start to pull, and if you go in the direction that you're being encouraged to go, it usually ends up being better than you ever thought it could be.
Do you think, you know, fabric, textiles are a safe, sort of a safe space to carry that storytelling through their work or people's work?
Yeah, I think there's a few things with textiles. One, I think we just all, I mean, we spend our whole lives touching textiles, whether we talk about that or not. I mean, I find it really interesting that people know more about cars than like the makeup of the fabric that they put on their bodies every day, because we all get dressed every day for the most part, you know. But we don't necessarily talk about how much fabric plays into our lives, right? Baby blankets, bedclothes, underwear, like we touch fabric all the time, and I think in part of that too, there's a certain attachment that we have to people we know who were handmakers, whether it was a grandmother or aunt. And if I knit in public, I often get approached by strangers because they want to tell me the story of a sweater that was made for them, or you know, somebody who's passed away that used to knit. So I think it does sort of help to have that emotional feeling to the materials you're working with. But then also, I think with textiles have always been a bit under the radar. And I think there's a room to do expressive work in them that is surprising, that you couldn't necessarily do in a painting now. I think the amount of time it takes to make something through textile work, to embroider a phrase, is much more meaningful to me than to paint a phrase, because it takes so much time and attention. Freddy Robbins is an artist that I featured in the book who does really interesting work with knitting and textile work. And she made this project in 2002 called Craft Kills, and it's a very violent image. It's basically a gray bodysuit. It looks like a three-dimensional human, and it has craft kills on the stomach, and there's knitting needles pointing at it. And one of the things she was saying when we were talking about this piece is that, you know, what if craft was something violent and arresting? Like, it doesn't always have to be something warm, fuzzy, and nurturing. And because we expect it to be that way, it almost makes a piece like this more powerful than if it was, say, a clay sculpture or something like that. And there's a lot of room to do broad expression with something like knitting or crochet or embroidery that just hasn't been done before.
What sort of the whole issue with galleries and museums sort of overlooking textiles as sort of an underrepresented in all our galleries and art museums. Why do you think that is? I mean, this is so powerful, this piece by Freddy Robbins.
Yeah. I mean, there's a few things going on there. One, textiles do need a certain level of preservation that other art doesn't. But I also think there's just been an association with textiles and all craft as just functional rather than artistic. I think there's always been a very strong line drawn there that's starting to break down now. I still think that there's an underrepresentation of women and womanly arts in the gallery system, where they're not taken quite as seriously. And that's, I mean, the work that the Guerrilla Girls were doing, talking about women in the realm of art and art galleries and art spaces, I don't think that's changed a lot since they started, and it's been over 30 years.
Yeah,
so I think there's still, I think it's starting to change, but I think there's still that pigeonholing of textiles being a community art or devalued because it's something that everybody can do, but not everybody does it, and not everybody can do it. It's still a learned skill. And it's still something that takes a lot of artistic expression, but we don't talk about that part as much.
So it's, yeah, it's just, it seems craft sometimes is dismissive. They dismiss that as art. So
Right.
the lowbrow versus highbrow, it's a gray area.
Mm-hmm. And I really love sort of working to dissolve those kind of boundaries. I mean, I studied art history as an undergraduate student. I did a degree in art history and creative writing. And while I was working as a student doing art history research, I was working for the art gallery at the university. And I was spending my summers working in a community arts council where members of the public would come together and learn how to make things. And those are three worlds that really didn't mix very much. And I've always had a hard time understanding why, because I just think having that exchange makes things far more interesting.
Do you think, when I move into the craft as craftism, or craft as the political, the textile protest, side of crafts, do you think that would help get the recognition because they're taking on such relevant issues of the day? I don't know. I just think if it's more poignant to what's happening on.
I mean, I think it can help. I think that's one reason why yarn bombing's been fairly embraced by galleries and art spaces, because it is out in the landscape. It's done in a very non-traditional way. And I would love to see more of that. I'd love to see more galleries embracing things like craftivism and activism through textiles. But I also really love the idea of art being made from personal stories. I mean, we watch visual artists or video artists do video documentation work. And if it's done on grainy film footage, it might be considered gallery worthy. But if it's done on a stitched piece of cloth, why wouldn't that also be equal within the art world? So in some ways, I just would love to see galleries and art spaces not dismiss things because of the materials things are made out of.
Were there any in your book that you want to point out were the textiles of protest and politics and power? Were there any particular ones that you really resonated with you?
Yeah, so there's an artist working in Las Vegas. Her name's Diane Bush, and she was a documentary photographer by trade, and then she started becoming a gallery artist, and she was making these large-scale canvases where she would blow up images from American news media. So George Bush, Mitt Romney, people who were given a lot of airtime, and then she was throwing buckets of bleach on them to bleach them out, to sort of erase those truths, sort of to come up with maybe her own vision of coming back to something that was a little bit more not so right-leaning, I guess, might be the best way to comment on it. I'm Canadian, so I always have a hard time commenting on American politics. Because it's our left and your left and right and conservative are very different across the borders, right? But what she decided to do was actually then take those images and put them onto weavings. And she made blankets with these images on them that were destroying news media and what she felt was propaganda, and then giving them to Occupy protesters. So she went to 4 different cities to give these blankets to the protesters to clothe them and make them warm.
See, is that the? Oh, here we go. We do have.
These are Diane's images. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Look at that. That was interesting to interview her, and just the throwing of the bleach.
Interesting to watch somebody come from a photography background and end up doing work with textiles in order to make an impact. Because normally we would consider photojournalism would be the perfect way to do that, but textiles almost make a bigger statement. And then there's 2 women, Alexia and Nema, who have a spoken word duo called Climbing Poetry. And they had this project I really wanted to talk to them about called Stitched. And they said, well, we do very little things with textiles. And I said, but this is a really important textile project. And Stitched is a project they started around the time Hurricane Katrina had hit New Orleans. They were on their first tour for their spoken word project. And they started taking cloth squares and putting them on the seats of people who came to see their shows. And they asked people to write down something that was resonating with them, a truth, So a lot of these are statements just written in Sharpies on a piece of cloth that people would leave behind. And they take all of these squares and they stitch them into prayer flags. And some of these images are actually their 10-year anniversary party. Growing, they're at the point where they can't hold them in one spot anymore. They have so many of them. But the idea is that they're collecting stories and voices of people who aren't normally heard in news media, and patchworking together things as diverse as, you know, I'm happy today, to I'm coming out, to I have a family member in jail. And the idea is by collecting all of these collective voices, it creates a bigger story about the world and where we are and where people come together. They sort of joke that they call it a new American flag because they're collecting the voices of all sorts of people in all sorts of different states of their lives. So I really love this project.
Wow, yeah. It sort of reminds me, well, I mean, community and collaborative work, I think back to the AIDS quilt is another really relevant and powerful piece that we all remember, I think. I remember I was living in Washington, D.C., and I remember them putting that out on the wall there, and it was just, you know, jaw-dropping. So I don't know, I think, I don't know, do you have any other things you might want to share about community and collaborative work? I see people from my vantage point through Facebook and through the magazine. I am always amazed at when someone posts something about doing a community project, how expansive and how fast, you know, it's like, you know, fire in a, you know, on a dry plot of a big field, and it just catches on, and people are sharing and sending their pieces of little, you know, shared fabrics to, I don't know, it's like they want to be part of a community somehow.
Exactly. And there's an artist I featured in the last chapter, Lee Bowser, and she has a niece that has a rare anemia disease called blackfin anemia, and she actually couldn't donate blood herself. Her niece was looking for a transfusion, so her way of dealing with that was actually to start something called the Blood Bag Project, where she crafted a blood bag, and then she asked people to also create their projects and send them in. And I think to date she's had over 200 textile artists actually contribute to this project. And so they've crafted all sorts of different blood bags. So some of them are embroidered, some of them are hand-drawn on fabric. But it also has raised awareness of that disorder and donating blood. And it's been interesting to see it grow organically on the internet of people then wanting to share their stories.
Right. Wow. Well, that kind of brings us into the emerging technologies. I know you talked a little bit about Twitter and some of the poems that were being gathered from Twitter, but I didn't know, you know, what you're seeing in new and emerging technologies and their influence in the textile arts, other like the Twitter.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's one thing. Since the internet really became a visual medium, it's definitely made the world of people who make things a lot smaller and closer, if that makes sense. And I think there's been the ability to share images of your work and get people to trade. And I think, you know, I had a struggle with what to call that chapter, because in some ways it's new technologies, and your book comes out and 2 or 3 years later. I mean, Twitter's been around, I think, since 2008 now. So Twitter's not even a new technology, but I think the way that we're starting to write for Twitter is in a new form of storytelling, right? And the way people are now starting to tell stories of their lives through Instagram is really no different than photo documentation we did 100 years ago, but we developed a little shorthand. So I just wanted to focus on sort of how we engage with people through technologies and how that changes. I think 3D printing is going to change a lot of things.
Boy, I saw individual 3D printers scrolling through Facebook or Twitter or something, and I was like, wow, it's so small, it can fit on my countertop, and I'll be able to...
Exactly.
Whatever.
Exactly. I was at the University of Arts in Philadelphia as part of my book tour, and one of the heads of the program there was wearing a brooch, a 3D printed brooch, that almost looked like it was out of scuba fabric. I don't know what the end material was. And there was a student who was a jeweler there who was talking about printing in gold in 3D. So no longer casting something, but doing that. And there's somebody here in Vancouver that's invented a 3D printer for parents to buy. So the idea is you print out your child's toys, and then when they age out of them, you put the materials back in the machine, it breaks it down, and it reprints toys for the next level. So again, those are plastic and they're cornstarch, but when you start to get into wondering if you can work with fiber in that, you know, because again, you're not going to get away from things that are cuddly, right? Like nobody's going to replace the 3D printed teddy bear until it comes out in textiles. So
that's
possible.
Yeah, that's a great. I'm glad, Victoria, you found that image nice and quick. We teach. Yeah, that's an image from Full Sail University, and it's they do a lot of because they're working on modeling for animators, animation, and game arts and simulation. There's a lot of use for the 3D printer. So yeah, that was good thinking there, Victoria. Thank you.
Yeah. And one thing that occurs to me too is I wonder how many artists. I mean, I have a print design background. I worked as a graphic designer for many years, and I remember when books were fairly new, they on the internet when Amazon was new. People would figure out how to design a book cover so it would look better on the internet. And I kind of wonder how many people now are knitting or sewing so something looks visually better online, you know? Now that we have these worlds of all these micro technologies and checking internet on the phone, and I'm wondering if that will also change how visually we handcraft things as well.
Well, it's exciting. I like being part of the evolution and watching it all happen. I wonder, you and two of your colleagues went on a tour.
We did.
Across North America. It was pretty fast-paced. You guys were, every time I blinked, you were in a different city. I don't know, do you want to speak to Betsy and Kim's book as well?
Sure. So Betsy and Kim are two other authors who I did a 9-city, 12-event tour on. I just came home 2 days ago. Betsy is the author of Craftivism, which is a book about craft and activism. So all of the interviews and essays in the book are people who are working through various forms of activism, whether it's creating nets to go on abandoned basketball hoops or tennis courts, to leaving kind gifts for strangers that they'll find, to people who are creating protest banners through embroidery and encouraging people for voter reform, the UK Craftivists. And both Kim and I actually put essays in that book, so we had a nice synergy there. Betsy is also with Arsenal Pulp Press. And Kim Worker lives in my city, and she's married to a Canadian, but she's from New York originally. And Kim started a website called Crochet Me back in the, I guess, early 2000s. And after Crochet Me, she started, she was the first editor of Interweave Crochet. And so she had a not quick career, she had a 5 or 6 year career in the crochet arts. And this is her, I think, 7th book. And she's gone completely different tack. She's written a lot of visual how to crochet books. And this book was about creative demons and finding where you are as somebody who makes things and getting over maybe some of the things that stop us from creating. So it was really wonderful to go on tour with both of them because we did panels and got to talk about creativity and getting over struggles as a creative person in textiles and the changing nature of textiles and getting away from Pinterest pretty and maybe trying to make some work that have more meaning than just something that's delightful to look at.
Were there any cities that you felt really there was a huge fiber community response? I know as I go around different parts of the country, sometimes I find I really don't think we have sheep in Florida. So sometimes I think it's hard to get, some communities are in like Seattle in the Northwest, the hot, warm, fiber, getting crochet, working on felt with hot water and glass blowing, hot shops. Yeah. It's so alive up there. And I didn't know while you were going around to all those cities, was there a difference in
I think there was. I mean, I thought it was interesting. In Oakland, we had an incredible turnout of people who have craft stores or who are quilting artists or embroidery artists. We went down to Portland, and I found that interesting because we were staying in people's homes, and everybody who we met and encountered is a working designer or an artist. And it was during Portland Design Week, which is a big thing within the communication design community. But it was really interesting to see people who sort of traverse between the worlds of graphic design and stitch work and sewing. And part of that, I think, is Portland's economy. It's fairly reasonable to live there as an artist. So there's a lot of people reinventing and collaborating on things. Where San Francisco, it's a little bit more expensive city. So people tend to end up in Oakland because it's easier to be an artist there. Toronto was really wonderful. We ended up being with Knitty editor Amy Singer. So we talked a lot about the politics of craft in Toronto. We were at the Textile Museum there. And we had a very rainy, stormy night when we were in Boston, but we were at ICA there. And so there's a lot of people really doing textile research and textiles and stories. So it was a bit more intellectual in Boston. So we got asked harder academic questions on the East Coast. So where I think on the West Coast it was more about handmaking. So.
And you were talking yesterday when we were meeting about the Smithsonian and how there was some of a shift or an awareness. I know they're recalibrating their textile museum there, which is exciting. I'm very eager for when that Renwick opens again. But I don't know, you felt the Smithsonian was asking a different type of question, or?
I think, well, we were hosted by Nora, I believe, Atkinson, who's the new curator of craft for the Renwick. So she actually said that we were her very first public event. I think we actually surprised them a little bit because we were a public program, and they didn't think maybe it would be all that well attended, but the day of, they actually got to send out an email asking people to make sure that they showed up and claimed their seat. So I don't think they necessarily thought that craftivism or creativity talks would be something that would be so appealing to people who would attend typically formal lectures at the Smithsonian. So again, that's sort of playing on the high art versus low art, and how do you make gallery work accessible, or how do you bring work that wouldn't necessarily be considered gallery work into a gallery, which is sort of one of the things I love. I get the opportunity to do. Talk with artists who normally you wouldn't think would be at the Smithsonian, but you can bring them in with conversation.
Well, that's exciting. I think it's, I love hearing that. I love hearing that your books are, creating that conversation. And I just, I want to sort of wrap up because I know we've been on for a long time here, and I really appreciate you taking so much time out of, I know you're busy few months here. But I just kind of want to end on a note that it's like as you went around the continent, what trends were you noticing in fiber and textiles? Was there something new that you're seeing, or it's kind of a hard question because.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's sort of a thing where we're all coming back to expressing ourselves personally, and maybe this is more something I'm looking for because it's something I personally want to see, what you want to see, but I've been talking a lot about how I think crafts that are like pattern kits and things are a wonderful way for people to get started in craft and making that may not have ever approached that. But it's always nice to see people try and break out of that box and try something new. And some people don't know where to start. And I think maybe starting with your own personal experience is always a great way to take that leap to try something new. And I think there are a lot of people doing things in that way. I met Sonia Phillips, who's a woman who started sewing. She started 100 Acts of Sewing when I was in San Francisco. And one of the things that Sonia has done is she sewed 100 dresses in a year to clothe herself. And that was sort of a way of getting away from mass production and, not only teaching herself how to sew, but also comment on, we buy a lot of stuff. And as I travel more, I mean, I love going to cities, and I'm an urban person. Like, I love visiting cities, and I love unique culture, but I do get a little bit depressed when I'm like, oh, there's a gap here, and there's a gap there, and we're all buying the same stuff, and now with the internet, you go on Etsy and you think you're buying handmade stuff, but you'll get 6 things that look fairly similar. So I really love that return to uniqueness and personal experience, because I think that can't be replaced, and I hope more people are doing that in their work.
Well, I think looking at your book, Strange Materials, I'm going to flick this back on over here. I think by going through and hearing and reading the artists that you've included in there, really is and the prompts, it really gets some your thinking process going, and I don't know, gives people who may not try something a reason to. Even as simple as getting the bleach pen on a T-shirt and using that to write on. It's so it's all right here in my laundry room. Makes it very accessible and a great way to be creative without feeling like you have to be a major gallery artist or anything. But anyway, it's a very good book. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today, and this I don't know, we appreciate all the getting out there and working and challenging our thinking process and bringing the artists that you have in here so we can see them, because so many of them I would never have heard of, and they are so relevant and authentic. It's really important. So anyway, thank you very much,
Thank you,
Leanne, and I look forward to seeing your next project, your next book, and your next adventure. And I hope you make your way down to Florida for your next book tour.
I'm definitely going to try.
All righty. Well, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.